My mother-in-law threw my wedding bouquet straight into the trash and told everyone I was just a phase, that I'd never be good enough for their bloodline. Guests laughed behind champagne glasses, and even my family was pushed to the back as if they were nobodies. But when 3 black SUVs pulled into the driveway and my private security team walked in, calling me by a last name no one expected, her world collapsed in front of every single guest. If you've ever been treated like you don't belong, stay with me, because what happened next will leave you breathless. They say every love story begins with a moment you never forget. For me, it wasn't the first kiss, the first laugh, or even the moment he slipped a ring on my finger. It was the first time his mother looked at me as though I were nothing more than a stain on her polished tablecloth. That was the moment I realized this story wasn't going to be about flowers and music. It was going to be about survival, dignity, and proving that I was not temporary. If you've ever been treated like you don't belong somewhere, if you've ever had someone dismiss you before they even knew your heart, then you'll understand why I am telling you this. Stay with me until the very end, because what started as humiliation became the day an entire billionaire family had to bow their heads in silence when they heard my real last name. My name is Selena, and when I first met Ethan, there was nothing about him that screamed money. He was warm, unpretentious, and full of an easy charm that made people feel at home. He wore worn sneakers instead of Italian leather, and he laughed at his own clumsy mistakes. I met him in a library, of all places, where he asked to borrow a pen and then spent an hour pretending to study while sneaking glances at me from across the table. He was genuine, and that was rare in a world where so many people were always trying to be something they weren't. We went from coffee dates in the rain to late-night phone calls where his voice carried me to sleep. He wasn't the type to flaunt a family name, and I wasn't the type to ask for one. What Ethan didn't know was that I carried a name too. One that I had deliberately buried under my mother's maiden name so I could live as an ordinary woman. I didn't want anyone to measure my worth by boardrooms or bank accounts. I wanted love, laughter, and the chance to be seen as Selena, the girl who cried at sad movies and cooked too much pasta when nervous, not as the heiress whose surname opened doors faster than any key ever could. I had grown up watching how money twisted relationships, how people smiled too wide when they wanted something, and I swore I'd never let that shadow fall over my love life. For a while it worked. Ethan loved me for me. He loved the way I hummed while cooking, the way I stopped to pet every stray dog, and the way I challenged him to live more honestly. He didn't care that I didn't dress in designer labels, or that I lived in a modest apartment. He never asked what kind of car my family drove or what my parents earned. For once, I believed love could exist without calculation. But love is one thing. Families are another. And his family was about to test everything I thought I knew about belonging. It was a warm Saturday afternoon when Ethan told me he wanted me to meet his parents. We were walking along the waterfront, eating ice cream cones that dripped faster than we could lick them, when he suddenly grew quiet. His hand tightened around mine, and he cleared his throat before speaking. Selena, there's something you should know. My family. They're traditional. They have certain ideas about who I should marry. But I know once they meet you, they'll see what I see. I laughed, brushing off the nerves in his voice. Traditional? You make them sound like they live in the 18th century. He smiled faintly, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. Sometimes I think they do. I should have listened more carefully. I should have asked questions. But I was in love, and love makes you believe the best in people before you've seen the worst. So a week later I found myself standing in front of the Ashford estate, my heart pounding like it wanted to warn me away. The house wasn't a house. It was a statement. Columns stretched toward the sky as if they were holding it up. Windows glittered like eyes that had seen generations pass by. The circular driveway could have held a dozen cars, and the marble steps were wide enough for royalty. It looked less like a home and more like a throne carved into stone. Ethan parked his modest car beside a fleet of black luxury vehicles that gleamed like predators waiting to strike. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel, and when he turned to me, his face carried an apology he hadn't yet spoken. "Just be yourself," he said. The words were meant to reassure me, but the tremor in his voice told another story. He wasn't sure being myself would be enough. The door opened before we reached it. His father, Leonard Ashford, stood tall in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. His handshake was firm but fleeting, and his eyes moved past me as though I were part of the scenery. His mother, Margaret, appeared seconds later. She wore pearls around her neck and an expression that could have frozen a river. Her gaze swept over me from head to toe, lingering on my skin, my hair, the cut of my dress. Every inch of her silence screamed judgment. "Welcome," she said, but it wasn't welcome. It was warning. The dinner that followed was a performance. Silver cutlery clinked against porcelain plates. Crystal glasses glowed under chandelier light. Ethan tried to fill the silence with stories about us, about how we met, about how much we meant to each other. But every time he spoke, his mother's eyes found mine like cold steel, questioning without words. She asked where my family came from, what neighborhood I grew up in, what my parents did. When I told her my mother was a nurse, she pressed her lips together like she had bitten into something sour. His sister, Clara, barely looked up from her phone, except to ask me in a falsely sweet tone if I was used to places like this. But the worst moment came when Margaret pulled me aside as I excused myself to the guest bathroom. The air smelled of lavender soap and polished marble, but her words stung sharper than any scent. "I don't know what your game is," she said, her voice low and clipped. "But my son is not a prize to be claimed. This family has standards. We do not dilute our bloodline with people who don't understand our world. Enjoy your little moment, dear, because it won't last." I stood frozen, the weight of her words pressing down on me like a storm cloud. I wanted to defend myself, to say that love isn't about bloodlines or status. But the venom in her eyes told me it wouldn't matter. She had already decided who I was without knowing me at all. That night, as Ethan drove us back, he apologized over and over, telling me his family just needed time, that they would come around. I nodded, but deep down I knew better. Some people don't change when given time. They just sharpen their knives. What Ethan didn't know was that while his mother was telling me I wasn't good enough, I carried a truth she couldn't even imagine. A truth that could change everything with a single word. But I wasn't ready to reveal it. Not yet. I wanted to be loved for me, not for the name that could silence her in an instant. Still, her words echoed in my mind, wrapping around my heart like thorns. Temporary. Diluted. Not enough. If only she had known the kind of storm that was waiting just beyond her control. The ride home after that first dinner sat heavy in my chest. Ethan held my hand the whole way, his thumb brushing circles across my skin, whispering they'll come around, like he wanted to convince himself more than me. I stayed quiet, staring out the window at streetlights that blurred into streaks of gold, wondering if love would be strong enough to outlast a family's pride. I should have told him what his mother had said to me in the hallway, how she warned me I would never be good enough, how she reduced me to a mistake he would outgrow. But I didn't. I didn't want to weigh him down with the ugliness of his family's words when he already carried the burden of loving me against their disapproval. So I smiled weakly, kissed his knuckles, and promised myself that no matter what storms waited, I would endure them as long as I still had him. 6 months later, Ethan asked me to marry him. He did it simply, without fanfare or staged perfection. We had spent the day walking through a coastal market, eating hot chips wrapped in paper, laughing at buskers and buying trinkets we didn't need. As the sun dipped low and painted the horizon with orange fire, he stopped on the pier, pulled out a small box, and opened it with trembling hands. "Selena, marry me," he said, voice raw with sincerity. I could see the fear in his eyes, the desperate hope that I wouldn't hesitate, that I wouldn't let his family's shadow fall across this moment. But he needn't have worried. I said yes with tears running down my face. Yes, like it was the only answer I had ever carried inside me. The ring wasn't about money or diamonds. It was about us. It was about every late-night walk, every whispered dream, every piece of joy we had built in spite of everything stacked against us. For a few blissful days I floated on air. We dreamed about our wedding together, whispered ideas about vows, music, and food that tasted like home. But when the news reached his parents, reality slammed back into me like a door. Margaret's response wasn't congratulations. It was silence followed by a clipped, "Well, I suppose we should start planning." As if my engagement was an inconvenience, a logistical problem she had to solve, not a celebration of love. Leonard's reaction wasn't much better, distant approval laced with worry about public perception. Ethan tried to brush it off, but I could see the disappointment pooling in his eyes. He wanted them to be happy for us. Instead, they acted like he had signed a contract they hadn't authorized. From that moment, wedding planning became a battlefield I hadn't chosen but couldn't escape. Margaret took control of everything. She chose the venue before I had even stepped foot inside it, sprawling manor outside the city, cold in its grandeur and echoing with wealth. She selected colors I despised, pale pastels that erased every ounce of personality I wanted to bring. She booked caterers that served food I barely recognized, menus designed to impress her friends instead of feed people with comfort. Every decision I tried to make was met with her thin smile and the same patronizing response. "Oh, darling, you just don't understand how these things work in our circle." Our circle. The words rang like a lock on a door she had no intention of letting me open. I wanted to fight back, to put my foot down, to remind her that this was my wedding, not hers. But each time I tried, Ethan would step in gently, caught between us, promising we could make small changes later, urging me not to upset her too much. His loyalty to me was unshaken, but his hope that she might change still flickered faintly, a candle refusing to die even when the wind kept blowing. I didn't have the heart to snuff it out for him. The rehearsal dinner should have been a moment of joy, a gathering of family before the vows that would change everything. Instead, it was the night I learned just how deep Margaret's cruelty could cut. The evening began with champagne flutes and polite laughter, with Ethan glowing at my side, his arm a protective band around my waist. But as I slipped away to the powder room to breathe for a moment, I heard Margaret's voice drifting through the cracked door. She was speaking to her sister, her words dripping with disdain. "It's just a phase," she said. "He'll realize his mistake eventually. Girls like her always show their true colors once they get what they want." My heart clenched so tightly I could barely breathe. I wanted to burst through the door, to scream, to defend myself. Instead, I stayed hidden, tears streaming silently down my face. I cried not because her words were true, they weren't, but because of the venom she carried in saying them, because of the cold certainty in her tone, as if she had already sentenced me without trial. I locked myself in the bathroom for 20 minutes, gripping the sink as if it could hold me together. When Ethan found me, his voice was frantic, his arms wrapping around me like a shield. He begged me to tell him what was wrong, but I couldn't. I couldn't bear to destroy the fragile bridge that still connected him to his mother, even as she tried to destroy me. So I buried the pain and told him it was just nerves, letting him kiss my forehead and whisper reassurances I no longer believed. As the weeks passed and the wedding drew closer, the weight of Margaret's presence grew unbearable. She spoke about me as if I were a stranger, someone passing through their lives temporarily, someone unworthy of permanence. She seated my family at the farthest tables, as if they were background extras in a story that belonged solely to hers. My mother, a nurse who had sacrificed everything for me, was placed beside distant acquaintances and vendors, far from the front where she should have been. When I protested, Margaret smiled sweetly and said, "We simply thought your family might be more comfortable there." Comfortable, as if she were doing them a favor by pushing them into the shadows. Every word, every decision, every look chipped away at me, but with each cut, something inside me hardened. It wasn't anger alone, it was resolve. Because while Margaret thought she was breaking me down, she didn't realize she was pushing me toward the truth I had buried. She didn't know that beneath the name I had chosen for myself lay a legacy so powerful it could undo every sneer she had ever thrown my way. She didn't know that the girl she called temporary carried a last name that could bring her mansion to its knees. The night before the wedding, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to Ethan's steady breathing beside me. He was the reason I had endured it all. His love was real, and I had never once doubted it. But love alone wasn't enough to protect me from the cruelty of a family who believed bloodlines determined worth. I realized then that I could no longer hide who I was. Not for their sake, not even for Ethan's. If they wanted to strip me of dignity in public, then I would answer in public. Not with anger, not with theatrics, but with truth. As the dawn crept through the curtains, I whispered to myself, "Tomorrow they will know. Tomorrow temporary ends." The morning of the wedding should have been the happiest morning of my life, but when I opened my eyes, I felt as though I were preparing for battle rather than vows. My dress hung beside the window like a fragile secret, delicate lace shimmering against the dawn. I touched it with trembling fingers, forcing myself to breathe, telling myself that whatever happened, Ethan's smile at the altar would be worth every cut and bruise his family had inflicted upon me. Yet beneath that determination, A knot of dread twisted in my stomach. I had decided the night before that I would no longer hide who I was, but carrying that decision into reality required strength I wasn't sure I had left. The suite bustled with bridesmaids, stylists, and the low hum of wedding day chatter. They fussed over my hair, dusted powder across my cheeks, and told me how radiant I looked. I smiled for them because I didn't want my fear to stain their joy. My mother arrived quietly, carrying a pair of earrings that had belonged to her mother. "Wear them, Selena," she whispered, pressing them into my hand. "So you remember where you came from. No one can take that from you." Her words wrapped around my heart like a balm, soothing the ache Margaret's voice had left behind. I clutched the earrings tightly, promising myself I would carry my mother's strength down that aisle. When the ceremony began, for a brief, shining moment, the world felt right. The music rose, the doors opened, and there was Ethan, waiting at the altar with tears brimming in his eyes. In that instant, I forgot about his mother's scorn, his father's dismissive glances, his sister's mocking smile. I saw only the man I loved, the man who made me believe in laughter and forever. As I walked down the aisle, every step felt like defiance, every breath like a promise that love could still conquer cruelty. When our vows spilled into the air, it felt sacred, as though nothing outside those walls could touch us. But once the reception began, reality returned with sharp edges. Margaret had outdone herself in ensuring my family felt excluded. Despite my quiet effort to move my mother closer, Margaret had corrected the seating plan. My family was once again tucked at the back, near the caterers, while her friends and associates filled the tables near the front. I watched my mother's face as she tried to mask her disappointment, her smile brave even as her eyes betrayed her hurt. Rage clawed at my chest, but I held it in, unwilling to create a scene before I was ready. The speeches began, and with them came humiliation disguised as humor. Ethan's sister Clara stood, her glass raised, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I've always wondered what kind of woman would be brave enough to marry my brother," she said, pausing just long enough for laughter. "Selena is certainly ambitious." The way she curled her lips around that word turned it into poison, as though ambition were a crime. She went on to talk about the Ashford lifestyle, her tone heavy with suggestion that I would never measure up. The guests laughed politely, some uncomfortably, but the damage was done. Every syllable reminded the room that I was an outsider, a trespasser in a family that had already decided I didn't belong. I clenched my fists under the table, nails biting into my palms. Ethan squeezed my hand, his jaw tight, but he didn't speak. He looked ashamed, and my heart ached for him, yet it also hardened. This was my life now unless I chose otherwise. When the toasts ended, I stepped outside to the garden, desperate for air. The roses swayed gently in the evening breeze, but the beauty of the moment did nothing to ease the storm inside me. That's when Margaret appeared, as though she had been waiting for me. Her silver dress gleamed under the lights, her pearls perfectly aligned, her eyes colder than the night air. "I hope you enjoyed your little performance," she said, standing beside me with her chin lifted high. "But let's be clear about something. This marriage might be legal, but you will never be one of us. You'll never understand our world, our values, our way of life. You're temporary, dear. Tyler will figure that out soon enough." And then, with deliberate cruelty, she reached for my bridal bouquet, which I had set down on a garden table. She lifted it, examined it as if it were an unworthy trinket, and tossed it into a trash bin with a flick of her wrist. "These flowers are already wilting anyway," she said, her voice calm and smug. The sight of my bouquet lying among discarded napkins and scraps broke something inside me. That bouquet had been more than flowers. It had been a symbol of joy, of a love I had dreamed of since I was a girl. Watching her throw it away as though it were worthless was the final straw. My chest burned, my throat tightened, and for the first time I refused to stay silent. I looked her in the eye, my voice steady though my heart thundered. "You know what? You're right. It is time I stopped pretending." I pulled out my phone, scrolled to a number I had long kept hidden, and pressed call. My voice was calm, almost frighteningly so when I spoke. "Marcus, it's me. Bring the team here. Use my real name." Margaret frowned, confusion flickering across her face. She didn't know who Marcus was. She didn't understand what I meant by the team. But she would. Oh, she would. As I ended the call, I felt something shift inside me. For too long, I had let her insults pierce me in silence. For too long I had allowed her to write the story of who I was. But not anymore. Tonight she would learn the truth. Tonight everyone would. I turned back toward the reception hall, where laughter and music spilled from the open doors, and I held my head high. I had decided the night before that the mask of Selena Williams was finished. It was time for Selena Ashcroft, the name I had hidden, the legacy I had buried, to step into the light. The Ashcrofts weren't just wealthy. We were power woven into every building, every contract, every financial artery in the city. And Margaret had no idea she had just tossed her own security into the trash alongside my bouquet. Inside the reception, guests were still mingling, sipping champagne and trading polite gossip. Ethan found me quickly, concern etched into his features. "Are you all right?" he asked, searching my eyes for an answer. "I will be," I said softly, gripping his hand. "But tonight things are going to change." He frowned, confused, but before he could ask more, headlights flared in the driveway. 3 sleek black SUVs pulled up, engines humming with quiet authority. Guests crowded near the windows, murmuring in curiosity. Doors opened, and men in tailored suits stepped out with the precision of soldiers. They weren't bodyguards in the way people imagined them. They were professionals, discreet and powerful, the kind of presence that made everyone pause. As they approached the garden, the head of the team, Marcus, walked with a stride that spoke of years of discipline. His eyes found mine instantly, and he inclined his head respectfully. Then, in a voice loud enough for Margaret and everyone nearby to hear, he said the words that would shatter the Ashford family's illusion of superiority. "Miss Ashcroft, your car is ready whenever you wish to depart." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's face drained of color, her mouth falling open as the name echoed in the night air. Around us, whispers spread like wildfire. Ashcroft. The Ashcrofts whose investments underpinned half the financial institutions in the city. The Ashcrofts whose name was synonymous with power, permanence, and wealth so vast it made the Ashfords' fortune look like loose change. I straightened my shoulders, meeting Margaret's horrified gaze. "Yes," I said, my voice firm and unshakable. "My name is Selena Ashcroft. And perhaps now you understand who you've been mocking all this time." The truth hung between us like lightning before a storm. For the first time since I had met her, Margaret was silent, her arrogance cracked open by a name she could not dismiss. And in that silence I finally felt free. For a heartbeat after Marcus spoke my real last name, the entire garden froze. You could hear the faint pluck of strings from the quartet inside, the clink of a glass somewhere at the back of the room, and the sharp gasp that tore from Margaret's throat. It was as though the world itself had leaned forward to listen. She had spent months crafting me as small, unworthy, temporary. Now she stood face to face with the weight of a name she could not dismiss. A name that carried with it a history of ironclad contracts, skyscrapers in city centers, and banks that decided the fate of entire families. Around us, whispers began to ripple through the guests like wine through tall grass. Ashcroft. Could it be the same family? Was she really one of them? The curiosity was laced with awe and fear, and every eye in that garden suddenly belonged to me. Margaret stumbled back a step, her hand flying to her pearls as if they might shield her. Leonard rushed to her side, steadying her elbow, his face pale as parchment. He looked at me differently now, less like a nuisance and more like a ticking bomb whose detonation could destroy everything he had built. "Selena," he began, his voice faltering for the first time since I had known him. You're truly an Ashcroft." I nodded once, my spine straight, my voice calm and steady. "Yes, I am Selena Ashcroft. The same Ashcroft whose signature appears on half the mortgages in this city. The same Ashcroft your firm has been quietly courting for years, begging for an introduction. The same Ashcroft family whose board meets quarterly to decide whether estates like yours stand or fall." The murmurs grew louder. Guests shifted in their chairs, some leaning forward to hear better, others pulling out their phones in disbelief. I caught sight of Clara at a nearby table, her eyes wide, her glass trembling slightly as she set it down. Her face was pale, drained of the smugness that had colored her maid of honor speech only hours before. She looked at me not with disdain now, but with dawning fear, the kind of fear born when the ground beneath you suddenly cracks open. Margaret swayed on her feet, her chest heaving as if the air itself had betrayed her. Then with a soft, pitiful moan, she collapsed into Leonard's arms, fainting dead away. Gasps erupted across the garden. Women rose from their seats, men rushed forward, and servers carrying trays of champagne froze mid-step. For a moment, chaos threatened to consume the night. But I stood still, bouquetless hands folded in front of me, a quiet storm at the center of their frenzy. I had not raised my voice, had not screamed or shouted. Yet the truth had knocked her to the ground harder than any slap ever could. Leonard called for water, his voice shaking as he helped lower Margaret into a chair. Her face was chalk white, her eyelids fluttering. Clara rushed to her side, babbling apologies that meant nothing, patting her mother's hands with trembling fingers. Guests crowded closer, some whispering with thinly veiled fascination, others already speculating about how quickly this story would spread through the city's social circles. I could almost hear the words forming in their minds. The bride they mocked was an Ashcroft. The family they belittled held the keys to their own fortunes. Ethan pushed through the crowd, his face a mixture of shock and confusion. "Selena," he breathed, his eyes wide, his hands grasping mine. "Why didn't you tell me?" Tears pricked at my eyes, but I blinked them back. "This wasn't the time to crumble. Because I wanted you to love me for me," I said softly, my voice trembling with emotion. "Not for my last name, not for my wealth, not for the power my family carries. I wanted what we have to be, real, untouched by what they think we should be." His gaze softened, his grip tightening. "It is real," he said firmly. "It's always been real. I don't care if you're Williams or Ashcroft. I love you. That's all that matters." The sincerity in his voice steadied me, gave me the strength to face the crowd once more. Margaret stirred in her chair, her eyes fluttering open. When they met mine, I saw something there I had never seen before: fear. Not the fear of me as a person, but the fear of what I represented. Power. Influence. The ability to undo everything she had worked for with a single phone call. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but no words came out. I stepped closer, my voice clear enough for everyone to hear. "All evening I have endured your whispers, your sneers, your insults. You judged me by the color of my skin, by the name I chose to use, by what you thought I did not have. You told me I was temporary, that I would never belong, that I was not good enough for your family. But let me tell you something, Margaret. The only thing temporary here is your illusion of superiority. That ends tonight." Gasps rippled again and phones lifted discreetly, capturing what they knew would become the story of the year. Margaret clutched Leonard's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve, her face contorted with panic. Leonard cleared his throat, his voice measured, but the tremor in it betrayed him. "Selena, let's not do this here. Family is family. Surely we can work this out." I laughed then, a low, humorless laugh that cut through the night like glass. "Family? Where was that word when your wife seated my mother with the caterers? Where was it when she told me I would contaminate your bloodline? Where was it when my bouquet was thrown in the trash as if my love, my vows, my entire being was nothing more than waste?" The garden fell silent except for Margaret's shallow breathing. I let my words hang heavy in the air before I continued, my voice steady, unflinching. "Respect is not earned by wealth or titles. Respect is earned by decency, by kindness, by treating others as human beings. Tonight you failed every one of those tests. You made me feel small, but I am not small. I am not temporary. I am Selena Ashcroft, and you will treat me with the respect I deserve, not because of my last name, but because I am your son's wife and I am worthy of it." Margaret's lips trembled as tears welled in her eyes. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. She looked around, desperate for support, but found only the curious stares of guests who now saw her cruelty laid bare. Clara fidgeted nervously, her hands twisting together, her fake smile faltering under the weight of truth. Leonard shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between me and the guests, aware that his family's reputation was crumbling before his eyes. One of the older women at the back finally broke the silence, clapping her hands together slowly. "Well said," she declared, her voice strong and unwavering. Others joined in hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. Soon the garden was filled with applause, not thunderous but steady, a rhythm of acknowledgement that what had just been said was truth. Margaret's face crumpled, her head bowing as the sound surrounded her. For once she had no power, no cutting words, no authority. She was simply a woman who had been exposed. Ethan wrapped his arms around me, pressing a kiss to my temple. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have stood up sooner. I should have stopped this before it hurt you." "It's not your fault," I told him softly, my eyes still on his parents. "But it is your choice what happens next." The night no longer belonged to Margaret. It belonged to the truth. It belonged to dignity. And it belonged to the promise that from this moment forward, things would never be the same. The applause faded into murmurs, and the garden seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would unfold next. Margaret sat slumped in her chair, pale and trembling, her pearls slightly askew as if even they were ashamed to be around her neck. Leonard stood stiffly beside her, his hand still gripping her shoulder, but his eyes darted toward the crowd, toward the cameras, toward the whispers he knew would escape these walls and spread across the city by morning. Clara lingered awkwardly, her lips pressed tight. Her earlier arrogance dissolved into silence. For the first time since I had walked into their world, I wasn't the one shrinking under the weight of judgment they were. The family who prided themselves on control, on legacy, on superiority, now sat exposed in front of their own friends, powerless to rewrite what had just taken place. I could have stopped there. I could have turned away, satisfied with the humiliation that had cracked their polished faade. But this wasn't about revenge, not really. This was about boundaries, about dignity, about ensuring that no one in that family or in that circle of guests would ever again mistake silence for weakness. I took a step forward, the gravel crunching beneath my heels, and every eye followed me. Margaret lifted her head slightly, as if bracing herself for whatever blow would come next. "You made your feelings about me clear from the start," I said, my voice carrying across the quiet garden. "You decided I wasn't worthy before you knew who I was, before you even cared to see my heart. You called me temporary, an outsider, someone who would never understand your world. But tonight, you've learned that your world is not as untouchable as you believed. Tonight, everyone here has seen what arrogance can cost." Margaret's lips trembled, and for a fleeting moment, I thought she might apologize. But the words caught in her throat, strangled by pride. Instead, Leonard stepped in, his voice low but firm. "Selena, we've made mistakes," he said carefully. "But we are still family now. Surely you don't mean to destroy us like this." I let his words settle, then shook my head slowly. I never wanted to destroy anyone. I wanted acceptance. I wanted respect. Not because of my name, not because of my family's wealth, but because I am a woman who loves your son and deserves to be treated with dignity. That is the bare minimum any human being should expect. And yet, you denied me even that. I paused, scanning the faces around me, guests who had dined at their table for years, who had laughed at their jokes, who now shifted uncomfortably under the weight of truth. "So here is how it will be," I continued, my tone steady, resolute. "From this moment on, you will treat me with respect. Not the hollow kind you reserve for business partners you're trying to impress, but genuine respect, the kind you owe to your son's wife. You will treat my family with that same respect. They are not background props to be seated with the caterers. They are my blood, my foundation, and they deserve to stand beside me proudly. And if I ever hear another word, another whisper about my worth, my background, or the children we may one day have, then you will learn firsthand how swiftly the Ashcroft name can close every door you rely on to keep your world intact." The crowd shifted again, whispers breaking out in hushed tones. Margaret's eyes brimmed with tears now, the sharp edges of her cruelty dulled by the fear of consequence. She looked at me not as a nuisance, not as a threat, but as a force she could no longer dismiss. Leonard's jaw tightened, but he gave a single stiff nod, a silent acknowledgement that the terms had been laid down and there was no negotiating them. Ethan slipped his arm around my waist, pulling me close. His voice was soft, but every word was filled with conviction. "I stand with you," he said, looking straight at his parents. "This is my wife. If you can't honor her, you can't claim me either." For the first time all night, I saw Leonard's composure crack. He looked at his son, truly looked, and realized that the bond he had always assumed unbreakable now had conditions he hadn't set. Margaret pressed a trembling hand to her chest, her lips parting as if to plead, but no words came. The power she had wielded so effortlessly for years had slipped through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to get it back. I turned to the guests then, lifting my chin, my voice warm but firm. And to everyone else here, I said, let this night be a reminder. Never judge a person by appearances, by skin, by assumptions whispered behind closed doors. You don't know the battles they've fought, the names they've carried, the strength they hold inside. Respect is free to give, yet it costs everything when withheld. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, followed by a smattering of applause, hesitant at first but soon swelling into something steady, undeniable. The same people who had turned their eyes away when Margaret mocked me now clapped, some even nodding as if to absolve themselves of complicity. It was bittersweet. Their approval wasn't what I had craved, but in that moment, it symbolized the shift that had taken place. The truth had turned the tables. Ethan squeezed my hand, his eyes shining with love and pride. We don't need to stay here, he whispered. Let's leave this behind. Tonight is still ours. I smiled at him, relief washing over me in waves. Yes, I said, my voice soft but steady. Let's go. As we walked toward the driveway, Marcus and his team moved in quiet formation, parting the crowd with professional ease. The SUVs gleamed under the garden lights, waiting like sentinels. Behind us, I could hear the low hum of chaos, Margaret crying softly, Leonard whispering frantic reassurances, Clara scrolling desperately through her phone, no doubt searching my name and finding confirmation of everything they had just learned. The guests buzzed with excitement, their voices carrying the story that would echo far beyond this night. We slid into the waiting car, the leather seats cool against my skin, the hum of the engine steady beneath us. Ethan turned to me, his lips curved into a smile despite the turmoil we had just left behind. Anything else I should know about my mysterious wife? He asked, his tone teasing, though his eyes brimmed with awe. I laughed for the first time that day, the sound light and unburdened. Well, I said, leaning into him, there is the matter of a private island. I thought it might make a nice honeymoon destination. He chuckled, pressing his forehead to mine. You are full of surprises, Selena. As the car pulled away from the estate, I glanced back one last time. Margaret stood in the garden, her figure small and shaken under the lights, her power fractured, her arrogance laid bare. She had thrown my bouquet in the trash, called me temporary, dismissed me as unworthy. But tonight, she had learned the cost of underestimating someone she couldn't control. Tonight, she had been forced to see me not as an outsider, but as the woman her son chose and the Ashcroft who would never again be ignored. The estate disappeared into the distance, swallowed by night, and with it, the weight of months of cruelty began to lift from my shoulders. I turned back to Ethan, the man who had loved me without knowing my last name, and I felt the kind of peace that only comes when you stand in your truth. To everyone watching, I leave this. Never let anyone tell you that you are temporary, unworthy, or less than. Your value does not depend on their acceptance, their wealth, or their approval. Your worth is in who you are, in the love you give, in the dignity you refuse to surrender. And sometimes, just sometimes, the truth you've been hiding is the very thing that will set you free. If this moment gave you the chills, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that prove respect is worth more than riches. Share it with someone who's ever been underestimated, so they remember their worth. And tell me in the comments, if you were in my place, standing in front of those in-laws after everything they did, what would you have said?